From United Nations headquarters in New York, this is World Chronicle, an unedited interview program about major global issues. Here now to introduce our guest is the host of today's World Chronicle.
I'm Michael Littlejohns, and this is World Chronicle. Leaders of finance, foreign affairs, and development cooperation ministries, a combination rarely found in the same conference room, met recently under the auspices of the United Nations Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC. They assessed the impact of global financial integration and discussed ways of promoting financial stability. The meeting was particularly timely in the light of recent financial upheavals in East Asia. Our guest today was a participant in this landmark encounter. He's Nitin Desai, Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. Joining me to talk with Mr. Desai are James Bone from the Times of London and Anne Penketh of Agence France Presse, AFP. Mr. Desai, welcome to World Chronicle. Mr. Under-Secretary General, why has it taken more than 50 years for this idea, which seems like a pretty good one, to have developed and have been executed?
Well, because I think in some ways the two sets of institutions had their own functions and purposes. And
when you say two sets of institutions?
The Bretton Woods institutions, which are essentially...
The financial bodies.
The two financial bodies in Washington.
The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
That is right, and the United Nations in New York. But we did have a lot of contact at the Secretariat level. The two heads of the Washington institutions have been regular visitors to ECOSOC, and at the Secretariat level there's always been extensive contact. What was unique about this was the contact at the intergovernmental policy-making level. And it was a meeting of the Economic and Social Council which invited people who normally participate in the Washington processes. So it's not really a joint meeting. It is an ECOSOC meeting, but the participants were drawn mainly from people who normally go to the Washington meetings.
But if these guys wanted to meet on the financial side and on the foreign affairs side, they could do it without the intervention of the UN, could they not?
They could, but I think the advantage here was not simply a question of getting the same cast of characters to meet in a different environment, but there were some differences. I think what the meeting did was to bring development into the financial agenda. It's not that it's missing in Washington, but in some ways the concerns which shape discussion here are much more long-term developmental concerns, concerns about equity between countries, concerns about symmetry of influence on global processes. And I believe that is what the ECOSOC meeting helped to contribute to this discussion.
This proposal was endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly. Who actually proposed it in the General Assembly?
Well, the initial proposal, came from the United States. And of course it was supported by the others, and it was a unanimous resolution. And it was partly a reflection of a lot of discussion that has been going on, not just in the UN, but in the G7 process and elsewhere, about the need to give the global economic system a degree of political direction and of strengthening links between the Bretton Woods institutions and the UN institutions. So it was the US which proposed.
And did the United States follow through at a high level? I mean, was the Secretary of State and was the Secretary of the Treasury, were these people present?
No, the United States was represented there by the Ambassador for Economic Affairs here and by a senior official from the Treasury in Washington. But of course the Secretary of State, as you know, was not there.
When you say to give it a greater political direction, what exactly do you have in mind? I mean, that would send alarm bells ringing probably through the markets.
Okay, let's use the word policy direction, not necessarily political direction. What I mean by this is that increasingly we are getting into a regime where what we decide at the international level needs to be implemented voluntarily by countries. That it does not, it's not like the old fixed exchange rate system where there was a global system which had to be followed as a rule by others. Increasingly you're dependent on governments doing things which are desirable on their own, so to speak, as part of a globally agreed policy consensus. Now, if you want that, you need a process in which they have a sense of commitment and policies about which they have ownership. That's what I meant by political direction, not so much a question of politicizing decisions, but ensuring that what comes out as a policy is something in which the people who have to implement it, the national administrations, have a sense of ownership. Because that's a change.
One of the things that seems to be going on here is you have two bodies. You have the United Nations and you have the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And there's a different equation of power in each of those two groups, clusters of bodies. Of course, in the Washington-based bodies, the IMF and the World Bank, the rich countries are very much more powerful, and it's basically the Treasury ministries who are involved in running the policy there. And to some extent, the poor countries resent that because they are the subject of the policies that the IMF and the World Bank impose on them. And at the UN, of course, you have the foreign ministries and you have a lot more clout for the developing countries. And really, there's been a shift in economic policy and international economic policy from the UN down to Washington over the last 5 or 10 years. And isn't this an attempt by you to redress that balance a little bit and bring some action back to New York?
I would say that on development, it's probably also been the other way around. For instance, today, the types of issues that do dominate global discussions on development, like sustainable development or human development, were things which came out of a UN process. I would argue that, in fact, a UN process in which all countries participate more or less on an equal footing is a process which is designed to give countries a sense of ownership and commitment about what comes out. And for today's world, when what we are trying to decide at the national level has to be implemented voluntarily by countries, this is a very valuable characteristic. And I think it's being increasingly recognized. And therefore, there's a much greater willingness for an experiment of the sort that we had on Saturday now than would have been the case 10 years ago.
Is this going to become some kind of process then?
No, at the moment, this was a mandate was just for one meeting. We have another process going which is closely linked, and that is the General Assembly has decided to launch a process of some form of global discussion on the issue of finance and finance for development. They started in the General Assembly last fall, and it's something where they are committed essentially to some type of event or process or occasion before the year 2000.
If I may just, you have a great decline in overseas development assistance, particularly relative to private investment around the world. And the focus has moved from official development aid towards managing free markets. That's really the ball game now, and it's widely accepted almost everywhere in the world that that's what's happened. So what do you have in mind in terms of managing free markets? What can that process contribute?
So 3 or 4 things were stressed in this discussion in terms of, first, you need an institutional structure for managing markets. We do not have that institutional structure. One of the points that I believe we have to address is how are we going to get that institutional structure? What is the mechanism for getting to it? Second, that within this framework of institutions which should establish monitoring standards, contingency arrangements, provide a platform for a dialogue on national and international policy, we will have to worry about symmetry and equity between countries, because you're not going to have for long a situation where a large number of countries who are increasingly more influential in the global economy are going to let somebody else decide what they ought to be doing. They are going to demand influence. That's one thing we have to worry about. Second, safety nets for the vulnerable. You cannot build a stable economy in an unstable society. And one of the things that we will have to worry about in this terms of management is what will be the shape of the safety nets? How do we commit ourselves to this? And the third thing, if you really want to keep the developing world fully engaged, is you will need a system which is capable of handling short-term economic crisis without unduly compromising long-term developmental ends, including things like investing in education, health, environmental management, and so on. So for all of these reasons, it's not as if managing markets means there's no role for public policy. I think there's been a certain reversal, that there is a sense now to recognize that, yes, we need to identify a role for public policy. And I believe the UN has done a lot of work in this area in the past 5 years. And this is just a further development of that line of work in the UN.
So the UN would sort of influence the debate then in some sense. I mean, because in terms of, the financial contribution, the UN represents peanuts, doesn't it, in the overall?
It's modest. I wouldn't describe it as peanuts. But yes, I think our main contribution should be in terms of influencing the debate and providing a platform for a policy consensus. as I mentioned, one of the key elements of global economic management is going to be some degree of compatibility in national policies and national macroeconomic objectives. We do not have any mechanism like fixed exchange rates which enforces that. It can only come through some type of voluntary acceptance of global ends. I think the UN is well placed in trying to get an agreement on what constitutes a good, sensible, national macroeconomic policy. It cannot take the place of the systems and structures you need for monitoring, for evaluation of what is actually happening, for surveillance, if you like, of the monetary system, and so on. But it can provide a framework for consensus.
Mr. Desai, in practical terms, what actually came out of this first meeting of its kind? Were there recommendations that will go to ECOSOC and ultimately to the General Assembly?
No. There's a chairman's summary. We never intended for this to be a negotiating session. It was essentially a session where I'd say three basic strands of discussion came together. One was what I would describe as a classical financial discussion, worrying about monitoring, surveillance, contingency arrangements, data reporting, data standards, transparency, etc. The sort of arguments we've heard continuously in the discussions on the crisis now. The second was
from the Asian crisis.
About the Asian crisis earlier when we had the Mexican crisis, the same arguments were heard. The second strand came from the finance ministries of the developing world, where the focus was on issues about symmetry, about worrying about vulnerable groups' long-term development. And the third strand was the development ministers, who said all this is fine, global financial integration is fine, managing crisis is important, but we have to essentially build all this around global developmental lens, most particularly poverty eradication, social development, and environmental protection. So these are the three strands which came together, and that was what I think was exciting about this meeting.
So what sort of follow-up then is envisaged? Are you going to meet again in a few months' time with the same players?
There were some references to the possibility of meeting again, but I hope that this helps to shape the discussions which the General Assembly has already launched on the process on finance for development. I hope it helps also to shape the discussions in this year's ECOSOC, for instance, when we take up the issue of market access. And let us see what comes out of this. At this point, what we were concerned with is to make people who have otherwise operated in separate spheres a little more comfortable in operating together. I think we succeeded in that.
Some financiers, notably George Soros, who's one might call him a financier philosopher almost, have called for new international financial institutions to regulate things like banking transparency. A lot of the central banks don't provide sufficient data, some of the currency traders feel, to be able to assess a country's financial strength. But what do you feel about these type of proposals coming from the private sector?
I'd say there is much more explicit discussion now, not necessarily of new institutions, but of a new architecture. That's the term which is being used. And a new architecture does mean you're going to do a lot of, it may be the same house, but you're going to do a lot of redesigning. So
possibly knocking down as well.
Well, possibly making two rooms into one or one room into two, that's true. So, but there is very explicit talk of new architecture now. And I certainly think that this is something which will develop. And I hope we can play a role in this.
This is World Chronicle. Our guest is Nitin Desai, Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. Mr. Desai, bearing in mind the acute problems that have existed and still exist as we do this program in East Asia, were these problems discussed during the meeting? And if so, did the members come up with any ideas to solve them?
No, I wouldn't say there was an explicit discussion of ideas, but certainly some assessments of the Asian crisis were made by the Asian ministers who were present. Remember, Anwar Ibrahim, the finance minister of Malaysia, and the finance minister of Indonesia were both participants Saturday in our meeting. I would say that the general assessment that I sensed, not just from them but from others, was that we are past the worst, but that we still have a long way to go before the processes of growth revive in Asia. This was a broad assessment that I got. And I think the focus was much more on trying to learn lessons from this crisis and the earlier Mexican crisis. And there was much more of a reference to how do we prevent crisis in future. There was also, another thing which struck me was there was practically nobody there who argued against liberalization. There were nuances on capital market liberalization. One could sense that some people felt, well, one size does not fit all. You must allow countries to pace themselves as they see fit. Some also were not entirely clear as to what is the role of the IMF in this area. As you know, there is a proposal to amend the Articles of Memorandum of Association of the IMF in order to give it a certain role in promoting capital market liberalization. So there were nuances. But I would say on balance, basically, nobody argued against rolling the clock back on liberalization.
Was there a consensus among the
I'd say
group?
so. I'd say that on these issues there was consensus. I think the real focus of the discussion was what do we need to do to prevent such crisis in future, which is where the institutional question comes in, and the adequacy of the contingency arrangements, the monitoring and evaluation arrangements comes in. And second, when such a crisis comes, how do we tackle it so as to minimize the collateral damage on countries which are not part of the crisis, which protects vulnerable groups and protects long-term ends and ensures a degree of symmetry between borrowers and lenders, for instance, in how the costs of such crises are borne. This is more or less the trend.
But each time there's a crisis, though, even though it takes place in the same environment of liberalization, it seems to be for different reasons. You know, the Mexican crisis was not caused by the same thing as the Asian crisis that we've just seen. So if you're drawing some lessons from the Asian crisis, how do you know they're going to be the right ones for the next crisis, which is also likely to take everybody by surprise?
First, I think that people sense that there are some things which are similar. But what I sensed from the discussion yesterday was people saying don't look for reasons and solutions simply in terms of national policies. There are systemic problems. You say these things were wrong in these countries, therefore they face this onslaught by speculators, if you like, or loss of confidence, whichever way you wish to put it. But their argument is, but there are other countries which have virtually the same policies, which didn't have this problem. There must be something systemic. And I think there is a recognition, yes, there are systemic problems which need to be addressed, not just problems of inadequate national policies. So I'd say that where the commonality may come is in identifying what are these systemic features. And I'm not sure we all know. Is the systemic feature in the lack of adequate information? Now take disclosure. One of the arguments which was put forward yesterday was that if you have disclosure standards for national government, should you not be talking in terms of disclosure for the global players? People talked of contagion. That one of the things that happened in the Asian crisis, which did not happen in Mexico, was contagion, crisis spreading from one country to another. Well, can we talk of circuit breakers, which prevents contagion? So there are some systemic issues which have to be addressed. And I believe that's where the common answers may lie.
There's really been a sea change at the UN over the last decade or two in the attitude of most developing countries towards the free market. I mean, I think in the 70s we had the whole drive for a new international economic order and highly regulated international trade. Now we have the UN as an institution embracing free markets. Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, recently published a report on Africa in which he prescribed free market economics, integration in the world economy, export-led growth, all these kind of things that maybe 10 or 20 years ago would have been anathema to many self-sufficient third world countries, like perhaps even India.
I would say that essentially success sells itself. And I think
you would say what?
Success sells itself. And that's probably the reason why it's more widely accepted. But I think it's also widespread recognition in most countries that they cannot just get off the world. They can't say, they really have to participate in the processes of globalization. We have young people in our countries who, if we do not become part of the global economy, are just going to abandon.
Is it also that the equation has changed between the rich and the poor countries, and now the poor countries can actually produce T-shirts or running shoes more cheaply than and more efficiently than people in the rich countries, and therefore, when the people buy those goods in the rich countries, the money goes to the people in the poor countries?
Yes, I think it's partly because of the capacity to participate in the global economy has increased. I think partly what has happened in the growth, the nature of the market that has developed in the industrial countries has opened up many more possibilities for developing countries, for T-shirts, for software, for motor cars, for a lot of things which the the populations of these countries demand. I'd say that yes, there is, of course, the gains from globalization have been very manifest in many of these countries. And as I was telling somebody, the 50th anniversary, I was very interested to find that most of the statements of free trade came from the developing country prime ministers and presidents, and most of those for managed and fair trade came from the industrial country leaders. So that changes the...
Mr. Desai, James Bowen has mentioned the Secretary General's report on Africa. You yourself have worked in the private sector as well as in the government and international affairs. And the Secretary General has proposed closer links between the United Nations and the private sector. Do you think that if you have another meeting of this kind, you might bring in people like George Soros, whom James Bowen mentioned, and some of the other tycoons? Would they have a useful contribution to make?
I would say that as what we had on in the ECOSOC meeting was an intergovernmental process, but we are hoping to bring people like Soros and the others into a much more direct dialogue with the governmental representatives who negotiate policies. We've already started that process. And I hope between now and the General Assembly, you will see much more of this. So
do you think that they might be brought into a future meeting?
I'd say the informal meetings, yes. And it is, we are already arranging a few things in the context of the GA. But whether we can move towards something where in some ways governments and the major players in the global financial system are equal partners in negotiations, well, I think that's a bigger issue. I'm not sure that the answer to that is very clear. Because what we are talking of is what governments ought to be doing. Certainly when we get to the stage at which we start talking in terms of obligations on the private players, we would certainly have to find ways of bringing them into the dialogue. But at the present stage, we are focusing on what governments ought to be doing through their fiscal and monetary policies.
Yes, because it seems to be almost impossible to think of how you could control the private inflows of capital into countries. How are you planning to tackle that?
I'd say that the mechanisms vary. If you take the Chilean experience, Chile basically used a tax mechanism. They actually put a tax on Chilean entities who borrowed capital abroad. And it was a very sophisticated tax. It varied by the term of the borrowing and so on. So it wasn't a barrier, but it was a tax, and it worked quite well in terms of containing contagion. I mentioned circuit breakers, but this is one type of circuit breaker, where if there is a problem in one country, it doesn't sort of spill over into yours very quickly, because there's a circuit breaker which prevents it from moving that quickly. So there are different ways in which this can be done, but there is some recognition now that maybe governments should be a little more cautious, particularly on the short-term borrowing end.
There seems to be an awful lot of economic integration at among regions.
Yes.
You know, the Americas are now the latest region to try and establish a pan-American free trade zone. Europe, of course, is very highly advanced and moving towards common currency for most countries. How does that influence your work, and how do these players, these regional groupings, how are they involved?
I would say this is one of the things which did surface in the meeting. The feeling that we need to address the issue of how the regional dimension will be factored into decisions. And this is something which we still have to address. We haven't worked it out, either in trade or in finance, or more generally in development management. it's maybe an agenda for a future meeting.
Mr. Desai, this idea of the European Union, of a foreign currency, the euro, what impact do you think that may have on the development process?
In principle, it shouldn't have an impact. It's essentially a mechanism for strong macroeconomic coordination within Europe. If it leads to the European economy growing more rapidly, if it makes the European public budgets more manageable, it should essentially generate resources for development. So in principle, I would not expect the euro to have an adverse effect if it works. And the current indications are that it will work, so I look forward to it. But the euro is a strong macro coordination mechanism, well beyond what is possible in other parts of the world.
Mr. Desai, we have less than a minute left. Looking at the current international financial, economic development situation, what's your general view of it?
I would say that basically the major issues that we have to solve, one was what we address, what the shape of the future financial system of the world. Two, the issue about the euro that you mentioned and the regional integration processes that we have, we still haven't worked that out. And the third is, I think, the necessity of ensuring that we do not forget that all of this is meant to improve people's lives, that social development, sustainable development are ultimately the real things that we have to work for.
So on the whole, would you say that you're an optimist?
Absolutely. We live in the best of all possible worlds.
And the best of all possible United Nations.
Yes.
Mr. Desai, thank you for joining us. That's all the time we have. And you've been a very interesting guest. Thank you for being with us on this edition of World Chronicle. Our guest has been Nitin Desai, Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. He was interviewed by James Bone of The Times of London and Anne Penketh of Agence France-Presse, AFP. I'm Michael Littlejohns. Thank you for joining us. We invite you to be with us for the next edition of World Chronicle.
Transcripts of the program may be obtained free of charge by sending a stamped, self-addressed envelope to World Chronicle, United Nations, Room S827, New York, New York 10017. World Chronicle is broadcast worldwide and features guests whose work is concerned with major global issues. This program is a public affairs presentation of this station from United Nations Radio and Television.